Hello and welcome to the Rubber Duck Dev Show. I'm Chris.
And I'm Kristen.
I'm Jeremy.
All right, and we are going to have a fun time today talking about Roda. Um, Roda is not something I was terribly familiar with before a few months ago. I started hearing a lot about it, so I reached out to Jeremy because I've had some listeners ask me about this, and so we thought we'd bring you on and talk about Roda because we know it's your baby, and um, I'm excited to learn more about that because it's got some interesting things that I don't know about yet. But before we get into the meat of the show, week in review. Preston, how was your week?
A blur. I can't even fathom what I've been doing. I know I've been working a lot, but I was struggling before we went live. It's like, is there any significant thing I've done? I can talk, and I'm blank. I'm empty.
Oh boy. It's just one of those weeks, huh?
Yeah. I mean, I may think of something, but
Where you wake up Monday morning and say, "Whoa, it's Thursday."
yeah. Literally, I was walking the dog this morning and I was like, what day is it? It's Thursday. How could it be Thursday? It was just Monday.
Right. Oh, well,
Well,
I
sorry.
mean,
I got another. How about you?
I got I've been getting a lot into the RSwag stuff and spending a lot of time in there and learning the Open API Swagger thing and how to automate all that, and it's complex, but it's once it's done, it's going to be really nice to have all our API documentation automated and not have to have customers calling saying, "Hey, this documentation doesn't have this field in it. Oh crap, we forgot to update the documentation." I'm tired of that story, so we're finally doing something about that, which is nice. And RSwag is turning out to be a really, really nice gem to help with that. So, yeah, if you're stuck in the doldrums of API documentation, check that gem out. It's helpful. Jeremy, how about you? How was your week?
My week it's been pretty interesting. Big news yesterday. So I work for the government. I'm actually an IT manager, and our big thing yesterday was an upgrade for what's called Primavera, which is a timekeeping system that's currently owned by Oracle, and
Mm.
it's a nightmare to deal with. And we had a big upgrade from like a 6 or 7 year old version to the current version, and
Oh wow.
thankfully that finished successfully with no problems. And the other big news I had was day before that, I merged a fairly large patch into Ruby itself to handle to make it so you can call methods with very large argument splats. So
Oh,
this fixes a bug in Ruby that was reported. It's the second oldest bug actually in Ruby, the
really?
second oldest open one, and I fixed that. On Tuesday is when I pushed the commit for that. So I'll actually be talking about that change a couple weeks at Ruby Kagi, which is the big Japanese Ruby conference.
Yeah. Nice. Well, thank you for that because I've got a lot of methods that have big splats and we're getting ready to have to do some work on some of those areas, so good.
Well,
Um
there's one thing I can chime in about is
all right.
that polling will take you far. Like with all the WebSockets
Oh,
and server sent events and different technologies, I was evaluating something and I evaluated all of them. And I was like, at the end of the day, as long as the server responds very quickly, like it's a very short response, polling can take you far. And it looks like what a design just using polling, even though they kind of want something semi real time, I think the polling is sufficient. So that's definitely something I was working a lot on today. Well, not today, but this week.
yeah, the WebSocket stuff can get really it can get complicated. And it's nice, but it can get complicated. So if you can get away with just a simple little polling routine, do that.
Yeah, and scaling is so much easier as well.
Yeah.
If you stick with the polling stuff, because like I've had experience where Rails's action cable insufficient performance wise, and we moved to any cable, which basically uses Go to handle the WebSocket connections. Um, but still, then you have to, if you want to ultimately scale out, you have to have now multiple servers to coordinate the WebSocket connections
Yeah.
that are separate from your, well, the servers don't have to be different, but the different services. So it's, yeah,
Right.
like you're saying, it gets complicated.
It gets messy.
Anyway,
Or you just end up paying for a WebSocket service to handle all that crap for you and
there you
don't
go.
worry about it anymore.
You pay up the dollars.
Right. As we talked about last time.
Yep.
So, all right. So let's get into the fun that is Rhoda. Jeremy, I'm excited. Thank you for being here to talk to us about this. I'm kind of excited to learn about this because there's some terminology in here that I'm not familiar with, and I've been deving for a long time, but this is some new stuff I get to learn. So my first question is going to be, why does Rhoda exist?
Okay, so Roda was actually a fork of another library named Cuba, which still exists. It's another web framework for Ruby. The general idea of Roda, what Roda calls a routing tree, was originally developed actually by the original creator of Rack. He created a library named Rum back in 2009, uh, which is lays out the general idea of basically routing a request based on the structure of the URL or the structure of the path, and sort of breaking it down into separate steps. Routing first part, usually routing by segments. So if your path starts with, slash album slash one slash whatever it is, you route the albums part first before you route the rest of it. So you have sort of incremental routing as you go along. That was the general idea. Cuba took this idea and sort of made it into a framework so that you could use. I fixed some of the bugs that were in the initial implementation, and I really like that. I'd previously been a Rails developer for quite a few years, uh, and then when I discovered Sinatra, I really liked Sinatra. It made things so much more simple than Rails did. So for many years, I'd say since 2008 or 9 until 2014, I was mostly focusing on Sinatra for any new development, while still maintaining some older stuff I had in Rails. So when I discovered Cuba, I really liked Cuba's way it broke down the routing sort of incrementally. Well, this is what Rhoda calls the routing tree, is because it becomes sort of tree-like. You route the first part, and then the next part of the segment can have a whole bunch of things. It ends up being very much like a tree. So that's why I call it a routing tree. If you're not familiar with the term, it's because I created it. So it's not like it's not like I took this from something else. I actually named it a routing tree because that's how routing is done. It sort of breaks it down into a tree structure.
Uh-huh.
Anyways, I like Cuba, but I like that part of Cuba. The other parts of Cuba I didn't like as much. It's not as friendly to use as Sinatra. So one of Sinatra's key points is that all of Sinatra's routing blocks return the body of the response, which makes it very easy to use. Cuba didn't have that. Cuba is very, I would say, explicit. You have to specifically say, okay, response dot write whatever the body is, and if you don't do that, it doesn't work. And I was trying to deal with the Cuba developers and say, hey, do you want to move in this direction or support a way to easily move in this direction? And they didn't really want to do that, which is fine. They had their own idea of how Cuba should work. And Cuba basically now is very similar to what was, 8 or 9 years ago. So that part hasn't changed. They're very consistent. Cuba doesn't change very often.
Yeah.
Anyways, I wanted it to be more Sinatra-like. So I basically took Cuba, forked it, and made it more Sinatra-like in terms of how it works. And then I added a plugin system to it because one of the big problems with Sinatra is it doesn't support very much by default. And with Roda, I wanted it to support like pretty much most of the things you can do in Rails. I had a need to do that. So instead of having like Sinatra extensions and plugins that were external, with Roda, everything is shipped with Roda. The Roda is designed on a very small core, and then it ships with like over 100 plugins, and you pick what you want to use. And all the plugins are tested at the same time of Roda. So when Roda is updated, you don't have to worry about any of the plugins that it ships with breaking. Everything's tested at the same time, which is one of the issues when you're using Sinatra or Rails with external extensions, is that Sinatra updates, Rails updates, and then your external extensions aren't ready yet and they break and you got to wait for them to be supported before you can update. So I wanted as much as possible for at least very common things to ship with Roda so that you didn't need to worry about so much external stuff breaking. Most of it ships with Roda itself.
Mm.
Anyway, that's the main reason I created Roda. In my Sinatra applications and in my Rails applications, the reason that you want to use a routing tree, just in general, the benefits of a routing tree, is when you're using Rails or Sinatra, you often have many routes that do the same type of thing. So, I mean, in terms of setup. So, like for example, if you were in Rails, you'll have a controller, and then pretty much all the actions in the controller need the same type of setup. Like if you have if you're dealing with artists, one of the things is to, all the routes are going to need to retrieve the artist first. And in Rails, you commonly would use a before filter for this.
Hmm.
And one of the problems with that is that have you ever had to deal with before filters in Rails?
Yeah.
They make code more complicated. It makes it harder to understand, harder to debug, especially when you get into things where it's like before filters that are conditional. Before filter if this, before filter unless that. It
Yeah,
becomes
that gets
very,
gross.
yeah, it's a huge pain. And I mean, I had been a Rails developer for many years. I was very familiar with this. Sinatra is basically the same issue. With Sinatra, all of your routes are independent. So Sinatra has something similar to before filters. Actually, it has before filters, and you can sort of make them conditional, but it actually gets much slower. One of the big problems with Sinatra in general is Sinatra's architecture is every route is independent, and when you submit a request to Sinatra, it just iterates over an array of routes. So if you have 1,000 routes and you request the last route, it's going through all 1,000 of those routes every time you make a request, which ends up being very slow. Sinatra does not scale well for large applications. This is another thing Roda fixes because of the tree-based routing. Instead of a request, or instead of the sort of called big O notation, it's not ON where N is the number of routes. It's usually like O log N for
Hmm.
routing because of the tree-based structure. In any case, the main advantage for me in Roda is that because the routes are not independent like they are in Sinatra and Rails, routes are sort of structured. So after you route the first part of the path, generally the first segment of the path, you can take actions like, okay, the route starts with artists. First thing we're going to do, and then like /artist/1, and then a whole bunch of everything else. Every route under that, you can sort of in one place you put like I want to retrieve the artist, and then it's available for all the routes underneath it. So what you end up with is a lot more shared code, and it makes it much easier to share code,
Mm.
especially if you have like it's very common in my applications. I deal generally with line of business applications for a government agency. That's sort of where I work. That's what the majority of my applications do. And it's very common for pretty much all my development is that most things will have a form that you submit. When you make a GET request, it shows you the form, and when you submit the form, it submits to the same route as a POST request. That's generally how I try to do my development to keep things simple. So all of these like GET POST sort of pairs have a lot of the same setup. And if I was doing this in Sinatra or Rails, like every one of those GET POST pairs, if I didn't want to duplicate the code, I would have to have separate before filters for each of these
Hmm.
GET and POST routes. And it becomes it's a nightmare to do that sort of work in Rails and Sinatra. So usually we end up with this duplicate code. And that's one of the things based on Rails design. It avoids duplicate code, and it makes it much easier. So you can read sort of the code from top to bottom and see how it's going to execute rather than figuring out what of the before filters are going to affect this request or not.
Right. So, real quick, hey Urban, how you doing? Welcome to the show. How's Ireland? Um, and welcome the rest of chat. Everybody who's sneaking around in there. Hope you guys are doing well. Feel free to ask questions. We will forward them on to Jeremy. He knows a lot of stuff about a lot of things. So, ask away. This is your chance. So you were talking about the fact that one of the things that you were trying to do away with is kind of the before filter methodology because it can get gross. And I've suffered through that a lot, so I hear that. You also talked about the fact that with this routing tree that like if I'm getting an artist and I get artist number 1, I can just get it with that first, like that top level route, and then kind of, I guess, pass that on down to other routes. Is that kind
Yeah,
of what?
you don't even necessarily need to pass it on. Like you can just set it to an instance variable, and then anywhere later in the routing tree, you can access that instance variable and it's already there. So you don't
Oh,
have to use instance variables, but that's in my experience the easiest way to do it, to retrieve it in one place. So when you have Roda, each of the requests is a separate sort of instance of the Roda class that you're using. And generally, you don't have to do this, but usually what I do is whenever I'm retrieving data, I just set it to an instance variable, and then later on in the route or in any templates that use the route, reference that instance variable and instantly have what I need to retrieve it in only a single place.
oh,
So
like the routes underneath that have access to that top level routes instance variables,
Yeah. So
as opposed to Rails being kind of encapsulated.
yeah. So one of the things to keep in mind is that with Rails, routing and Sinatra, routing is separate from request handling. So that's not the case with Roda. Roda integrates
Mm.
routing and request handling. So the way Roda works is that every request that you have is yielded to the routing tree block. So every request, so the routes are instance based. So as you're routing a request, you can also be handling it. So each part of the route usually get more specific, but it's not like there's one layer for the routing and another layer for the request handling. It's integrated. So you can do things like just have if statements around your routes without, sort of like procs. It's all sort of normal Ruby inside, which makes it very flexible and much easier to understand than other frameworks, in my experience.
Mhm.
so just for clarification, so if you have like in a route, nested routes that are like orders and items and say parts or something, or payments, um, I'll just do order items. So you're saying the route of orders, you can actually grab that instance item and then use it in the any other nested routes. If you have like 10 different nested routes, you could use.
Yeah. So if like you say of orders slash one, if you take that branch of the routing tree, the code executes and stores that order. Anything underneath that route can access it. If the route doesn't match, the way that Roto routing works is that it's sort of executed like you would execute Ruby code. It starts at the top. Usually, most of the stuff it's like r dot on some segment. So if your path is like slash orders slash one, the first segment it's going to be orders, just orders by itself. So you do like r dot on orders. If that matches, it passes the sort of handling inside the block, and no other routes are considered. Only the routes that are inside that block are considered. If it doesn't start with orders, it just moves on directly, skips the whole block, moves directly onto the next code. So it makes it very simple to target what you're doing. So that way, only, when you set something, only routes underneath it are affected. It does not affect any other routes that you're considering.
And if you have multiple nested routes, so say orders has, payments and items, like it's on the second level, but
Yeah.
there's many of them. You're saying typically you would have to create a whole new controller and views for in Rails for each of those, where that's not necessarily the case
Yeah. In
in
Rails,
Roda. Is that how you're avoiding the before
well,
action
inside
calls?
inside Roda, like as you're routing, because you can have orders, and then like usually the easiest way to do things in Roda is basically what you're looking for, like orders, and then usually like a specific instance of what you're looking for if it's targeted to a specific instance. So if you're looking for order three, it'd be like slash order slash three, and then anything else you're looking for, like items inside that orders would be after that. So you can retrieve it
Right,
in one
right.
place, and then later stuff comes after it. That's the easiest way to do it. I'm not actually that familiar with modern Rails routing and how it works. I can tell you that. I don't. My Rails work honestly. Even when I had Rails apps, they're all like Rails one style, where you like
Okay.
controller action ID. That's basically how all my Rails applications were, because Rails was originally designed. I never ever took the jump in my Rails apps to go to like the Rails 2, everything is REST type thing. I didn't really like that. It doesn't work well for the applications that I design. Most of my applications are like workflow applications that don't really mesh well with sort of REST design. So um, I can't really speak to like Rails routing and how it compares. But yeah, I can tell you that for that type of thing where you have many actions, a multitude of actions after like slash order slash one, all that's just like normal routing tree stuff inside your Road application.
So I got a kind of a visual aid here. Maybe you can kind of walk us through. I don't know if it's the best visual aid, but maybe you can kind of walk us through a little bit what this is doing in Rhoda. So
Okay.
this looks to me like a Roda route definition, right?
Yeah.
Um, so what are we doing? What are we saying here? What does this path look like? This URL?
Okay. So I'm looking at it. So it says class app, subclasses from Roda. So your app is a Roda app, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And the route method sets the routing tree. So every request that your web application is called with is going to be yielded to this route block. And the R variable is that's where the request is stored.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like a rack request. It's a subclass of rack request, and what it adds are routing methods. So r.on users here would mean if the request path starts with /users, then yield to this block. And if it doesn't, don't yield to the block. Just keep executing code after it. If it starts with /users, then it yields to the block, and then it says r.isList. And what is means is the next path has to start with /list, but is a terminal matcher, which means it has to end with /list.
Ah.
So if the remaining part of the path equals /list, so basically this only matches things where the entire path is /users/list. In that case, yield to the block. And again, if it doesn't, if the remaining path is not /list, don't yield to the block. So if it is /users/list, then it yields it to, and then you get to r.get. And what r.get means is this a GET request? If it's a GET request, then yield to the block. If it's not, don't yield to the block and keep on executing. So this entire Roda app is basically for GET requests to /users/lists, return hello users, I think is what it says.
Yeah.
It's very small on my screen.
Yeah,
if it's any other request, none of those, at least one of those blocks is not going to be yielded to. So basically, you're going to get to the end of the routing tree, nothing's going to match. And Roda handles that by issuing a 404, not found, because no route matched.
Which makes a little bit of sense. I mean,
yes. So, and that's basically it. So that's this very simple application. You don't have to do it this way. Roda is extremely flexible. You could do this in one call. You could do at the very top of the routing tree, instead of doing r.on and then under that r.is, you could just do r.get user/list, and that would do the entire thing this does in one line, really. So it'd be more efficient. It would be faster. It'd be easier to understand. This sort of shows you the nested levels, so you can see what happens to each level, but you don't have to do it this way. You can easily combine and condense this to make it simpler and faster.
So it could look a lot more similar to what a Rails route file looks like, with just the paths kind of listed out, or it can be nested like this.
Yeah. So you generally with Roda, you would choose whatever makes the most sense at the time. In some cases, you're going to use the nested stuff. In some cases, you'll combine it. It really depends on how many. If you only have one route in this case, it makes sense to condense it and combine it. If you have multiple routes, like if you're handling, let's say you're handling both get and posts for users/list, what you would usually do is r.is user/list, and under that you would have r.get and r.post. So get request would have the get block, post request would have the post block. And usually what you would have is before the r.get, you would have the setup for that sort of pair of get and post routes. Whatever is shared between them, you would move into that block, and the r.get stuff would only be get specific stuff, and the r.post stuff would only be post specific stuff. But they would easily share the code that's the same for both.
And is this, as I'm looking at this, what I'm starting to wonder about is this actually closer to what my controllers are doing in Rails? That this is actually controller code that gets put in here, not
in
really
general,
a routes definition.
Yeah, because routing or request handler combined, this is sort of like a controller. You can think of it if your Rails application is just basically doing like controller and action stuff, users would be the controller, list would be the action. You can certainly do things that way, but it's extremely flexible because this is just user code that you're executing. It's not like Rails where the routes are sort of, you put the routes in and then there's a Journey handles all this magic stuff behind the scenes. Journey is really good code, but it's hard to understand, and there's not a lot of flexibility. You don't have complete control over how the routing in Journey works. There's certain things that are supported and there's certain things that are not. You can't do like halfway through your route, execute this code and then make sure the rest of it handles that way. One of the things where this is helpful is, let's say you have different permissions, authentication, authorization type stuff. You can say like, if at any point in the routing tree, you can actually use normal Ruby stuff like next. So here, for example, let's say you had a whole bunch of routes. At any point, you could do like next, and either if basically if you want it to immediately go to a 404, you could just do next. And what happens with next is the block returns, but because nothing was matched, it returns 404 because there was no match. Or you
Hmm.
could do next, and you could put in a string, and that's the body, and then immediately any request that gets to that returns a body. So it's much more natural Ruby code because everything is executed at the instance level. There's not a mix of routing code in one level and then controller code in a different level. It's all the same with Roda.
That's actually very refreshing. And here's an example. I went to the next example in there where he's adding the post in with the get like you were talking about. He's
Yeah,
doing both the get and the post there. Um, but this is nice because it puts my routes in the same place as the code for those routes, so I don't have to context switch like I do in Rails and say, okay, I've
exactly.
got this action named this, but what's the route for that? Because that could be something completely different that's just
Yeah,
pointing to this action.
yeah, it's much simpler to understand in my experience. If you're ever training someone that's new to Ruby, it's much simpler to explain how Roda works. I mean, you can explain how Roda works in probably less than an hour, and compared to how much time they would need to take for getting up to speed with Rails.
Well, I know routing is a really difficult thing to teach people in Rails just because there are so many different conventions there and things that have been added on to deal with different situations.
Yeah,
And then
namespaces, nested stuff. Yeah,
yeah, and then there's no correlation necessarily between the action name and the route name in there. And so
yeah.
that's just all kinds of context switching and extra stuff you got to keep in your head.
Yep.
But so one of the things you were talking about earlier is the fact that Rails kind of and Sinatra, I guess, kind of have to kind of block out all those routes. So if you got 1,000 routes, it blocks them out. Whereas Rhoda can kind of step through. Um, is that how Rhoda actually thinks? Is how this is written? Is it kind of
Ah,
starts at the top and just works its way down until I get a
exactly. I mean,
match?
Roda is it's not really a framework. I mean, you can use it as a framework, but it's actually called I call it a toolkit because it's sort of more than a library, but less than a framework, if
Mm-hmm.
that makes any sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, your code is basically just executed. You're just calling methods on the request object, and either they match or they don't match. And if they match, they yield, and if they don't match, they just don't yield, and the code continues on. So it's very simple at the basic level to understand what is happening, and to customize it if you need to customize it. It's very flexible in that way. Lots of plugins that exist for Roda sort of change how things work individually. So you can make it so one of the for example, one of the defaults in Roda is that it treats different paths differently. So one example of this is ending slashes. So in HTTP, a request for slash a is different than a request for slash a slash. Those are two different paths.
Mm-hmm.
Some frameworks will treat them the same way. So I think Rails, it will ignore an ending slash in a path.
Yep.
Sinatra does not, and Roda by default does not either. So if the HTTP treats them separately, like you cannot an HTTP caching thing cannot cache. It's a different cache key. Slash
Right.
a slash and slash a cannot be cached the same way. Those are two
Mm-hmm.
separate routes. They should not be treated the same in my opinion, but a lot of applications do. I mean,
Yeah.
if you are going to treat them the same, really what you should be doing is redirecting from one to the other, but not everything does that. In any case, Roda again supports by default sort of more the HTTP wing where they're separate, but it has a plugin that if you want to ignore the ending slash, you can. There's a lot of plugins that are like that where if you want specific behavior, that's in a plugin. Like not the default behavior, but if you want it, it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Many plugins are like that. So I try to keep Roda's core as small as possible. And the idea is you only pay for the features you use. So for example, if you need a like HTML form-based stuff, there's a render plugin that supports like rendering um, templates. But if you have a pure JSON API type, need, then you wouldn't use that. There's a JSON plugin where you can just return like arrays and hashes, and it will automatically format those into JSON and return them. So you don't have to do any of the JSON formatting manually. You just basically have your block return the object you want to return into JSON, and it automatically converts it for you.
Mm,
Again, making things much simpler than other things where you have to manually say this is JSON, this is not. And you can mix the two in the same app. You can have like, okay, if it's a JSON request, then just return a string or return like an object like an array or a hash. And if it's not a JSON request, then you would to return, a template rendering for HTML. So you can combine those if you need to. So you can have the same application handle both, because in some cases, like if you have an API and a website and they have this sort of the same ability, just like what the return value is, you can easily handle that. Rails kind of supports the same thing. It has like response to what
yeah.
I forget what it is, but there's something similar in Rails where you can have it easily do this, where the same set of code happens and just the return values are different. Roda
Right.
supports basically the same thing, but it's can be basically the same.
Okay. So one of the interesting things that I saw on the Roda site was this were the speed comparisons.
Yes.
And I was really interested in understanding why these speeds are so much different. I think part of the clue is the routing, the way it does the routing and thinks about the routing would be my guess as to part of this. But can you explain to us why this is so much different than Rails and Sinatra?
So there's two reasons. So one, why is the initial speed so much faster? And that's because Roda is extremely optimized and does the very least amount possible by default. So like when you have a web request, when basically you're using a rack web server like Puma or Unicorn or whatever, um, basically as soon as those things call, your application, if it's a Roda application, it's almost instantly yielded to the routing tree block. There's very almost like no overhead at all. It's just like because what what Puma and Unicorn will give you, they'll basically call your application with what's called a rack environment.
Mm-hmm.
So it creates a rack environment hash and it passes it to the application. Doesn't matter what application you're using, Rails, Sinatra, Roda, whatever. That's just how the rack specification works. With Rails, there's a whole bunch of middleware, and then there's a whole bunch of routing, and eventually you get to what you actually want to execute. Sinatra, again, it's going through the array of routes and iterating over all the routes and finding a matching route. Whereas with Roda, it's instantly yielding to the routing tree block, and there's almost no overhead. And the matching in Roda is extremely optimized to be very fast. So that's why the initial part is faster. In terms of the request per second, it gets a little bit slower as it gets more complex, but it's still a lot faster because it doesn't slow down. Like Rails, it's kind of hard to see from these graphs because everything else is sorted at the bottom because Roda is so much faster. But what happens with Rails is Rails does not get much slower. Rails starts out slow, but it doesn't get much slower as you add a whole bunch of stuff to it. The
Right.
journey, which is the Rails router, is very good at handling large numbers of routes. Sinatra is not like that. It's hard to tell from the pictures here, but Sinatra starts out, fine, and then it once you get up to 10,000 routes here, it nosedives because
Mm-hmm.
every request it's going through 10,000 routes, seeing if they match, which is just completely inefficient. So with Roda, again, it's a tree-based route. So the way this particular benchmark called R10K works is that at 10 routes, it's basically just one level of 10 routes, and at 100 routes, it's basically for each of those 10 routes, there's another 10 routes underneath each of those 10 routes. It's a total of 100 routes,
Mm-hmm.
and up to 10,000 routes. So 10,000 routes is basically 4 levels of 10 routes per level. With Roda, that's basically, at most 40 comparisons. So it's, the very worst route, it's 40 cases that you have to
Mm-hmm.
go through. Whereas with Sinatra, it's 10,000 cases in the worst case you have to go through.
Good grief.
Rails is a little bit different than that because the way Rails works, it sort of goes at a character by character level. It uses what's called, I think it's NFA, non-deterministic finite automata, or DFA. I'm not sure exactly how Journey works, but it's sort of more character by character.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on the length of the length of the URL, but it doesn't depend on like how many segments you have, unlike
Right.
Roda. For most applications, it's not going to matter. Most applications, even very large applications, don't tend to have 10,000 routes. The 10,000 route case is like the worst case, but I would say it's not uncommon for applications to have 1,000 routes or more. I mean, I'd say 10,000 routes is very large for a Ruby web application,
Yeah.
but 1,000 routes is not. 1,000 routes, a lot of applications see that. Even my own routes, I don't know if I'm up to 1,000 in any of my applications, but I'm probably, six or 700, 800 at least.
Yeah. I don't think I'd want to work on a 10,000 route application. That would break my brain.
Yeah. So one of the other things is that like Rails, Rails is not designed. You can't even have multiple Rails applications in the same process. Rails is a singleton, whereas Roda, everything is just like a normal Ruby class. You can have 10,000 Roda applications in the same Ruby process, and it's fine. And there's multiple ways you can do this with Roda. Roda has a bunch of different ways to take large applications and either have them in separate routing trees if you want to keep them in the same class, or if you want to split them between classes. There's easy ways where that each sort of kind of route can be separated into its own class, which is not as efficient, but it's still fairly fast. So you're very flexible in terms of how you want to structure large applications.
Cool. So now I want to talk about too, because this was interesting, the memory usage. So you can see like Hanami and Rails and Sinatra have a pretty significant spike after 1,000 routes. Is that because they have to keep all of them in memory all the time so they can look through them?
Well, all of the applications do have to keep all of the routes in memory. It's just how they're kept in memory is different. So with Sinatra, there was an array of routing blocks. So each routing block is separate. With Rails, there's a whole bunch of different routes they need to keep in Rails. So there's some overhead there. I'm not actually sure too much how Hanami works, but it's basically the same thing. The reason Roda does very well in this benchmark is the routes are not kept they're not kept in data structures like arrays or hashes. They're basically, it's just one routing block or a whole bunch of nested routing blocks in a Ruby code block. So there are technically kept in memory, but you can't like say, I want to look at this particular block. It's basically just executes the routing tree and goes through each individual block and routes it. But the actual memory storage is actually at the sort of the Ruby program node level. It's not like user accessible. There's a flip side to this, which is that like in Sinatra and Rails, it's very easy to get a list of show me all my routes, right? I want to see all the routes in my routing. You can't do that with Roda. Roda, there's no storage of the individual routes. Everything is just Ruby blocks in the sort of routed at instance level. Two different requests can actually be routed completely differently. Like one request might not even be able to see routes. You might say, okay, this person isn't an admin in my application. They don't even get to see the admin routes. So you can have a bunch of admin routes, and if the person isn't an admin, they just don't see those routes. So like as terms of the request is, those routes don't even exist. Every application basically, or every request could see a different amount or different routes. So what this means is you can't get a list by default of routes in a Roda application because the concept doesn't exist. If you do need that sort of thing, there's a plugin for Roda that does it, but it's based on like parsing comments. It's not like there's not a good way to do this because it's not set up for that. Now in my applications, that's not so much of an issue, but if you're someone that relies very heavily on show me my routes and I want to see all the routes in my application, that's not Roda's strong suit. Roda just it's not architected to do that.
Yeah. So I guess I mean, you've built this nice compact kind of engine, for lack of a better term, and the common answer for a lot of questions is going to be there's a plugin for that, I'm assuming. Yes. But are there places that Roda struggles against other frameworks?
So again, the ability to list routes is probably the main one. Like if you need something where you need to introspect your routing tree, the Roda does not support that by default. The way it's architected, it cannot support that because routes are not, there's not like a separate class for your routes. Routes are just, Ruby blocks in your code. So like I said, if you need that, there is a plugin for it. It's an external plugin. It doesn't actually even ship with Roda because I don't really encourage people to do it because it's based on parsing comments. So for every routing block that you basically have to have a comment specifying what the route is and it will parse it and give you the ability to introspect it. But because it's based on comments, so you change the code, not the comments, then it's wrong. It's not like Rails or Sinatra where they can say these are the actual routes that are stored, and you have, you can be sure that that's what it's actually supported. With this, it's basically garbage in, garbage out. You can,
Yeah.
if you don't put the comments in correctly, you're going to have wrong metadata.
Kind of like my
So
API docs. Yeah, same problem.
yeah, exactly. Like your API docs. So yeah, again, if that's sort of very critical to your application, maybe in that case, Roda isn't a good fit. Those aren't the type of applications I work on, so I don't particularly
Yeah.
care about that. And again, it's not something that Roda can really fix. Just that's how the architecture is. Other similar libraries to Roda, Cuba, which Roda is based on. There's another similar one called Cyro, which is by the same author as Cuba. Um, all of those things with this sort of instance-based routing, so what I call a routing tree. Same issue. You can't. There's no really route introspection. Doesn't even exist in this sort of context. So again, if you rely heavily on route introspection, maybe not a good fit. Other things, though, pretty much anything you want to do with Rails or Sinatra, you can do with Roda. I would say pretty much anything you want to do in Sinatra would probably be better done in Roda. There's not. I would say I don't think there's anything that Sinatra does that Roda doesn't do better, except that Sinatra can be a little bit simpler to set up if you're just requiring Sinatra and just doing like get, slash users, whatever the response is. So for super, super simple apps that are like a few lines, Sinatra is a little bit easier. But once you get past that, Roda is probably a better fit for any Sinatra app. With Rails, you get to the thing is that the main reason to use Rails is, well, all these other libraries work with Rails, and that's a huge advantage. And all these other Ruby programmers are familiar with Rails, and that's another huge advantage. So the network effects of Rails are not something that Roda can easily overcome. So if those are your sort of things that are important to you, like what libraries work with it and what other Ruby programmers know it, Rails is going to have a huge advantage. Now, I would say that for most of the applications that people are writing, if there's a solution for Rails or Rails comes with it, there's probably a solution for Roda. You're going to have many more options with Rails. Rails, you might have 5 or 6 options for anything you want to do. With Roda, there might only be one option. And for some esoteric stuff with Rails, or whether it's only like one option in Rails, there might not be an option for Roda.
I'm
But
not
I'd say
so sure
those,
that's a bad thing, because sometimes all those options can just confuse the hell out of you.
yeah, like with Rails, I know there's a whole bunch of like form libraries, and Rails has the form helpers, and then
Yeah.
there's like simple form and formtastic and other things like that. And for Roda, there's something called, which I wrote, called Form A, which is sort of similar in that nature, but there's not too many other good options. So Roda, you might only have one good option for any particular thing, like authentication. There's devise and clearance and sorcery and auth logic for Rails. With Roda, you have Rodoth, and that's basically it. So um, keep that in mind. Just like in general, any less popular library, fewer options. It's just the nature of the things.
Yeah.
So I had a question about the plugin infrastructure. So you say that the plugins come with it or are tested with Roda when you do a new release. So how have these plugins been developed? Is it you individually that's developing each plugin, or people say, hey, I'm going to build a plugin for this, and they become part of it? How does that work for the project?
So I would say in a lot of cases, the plugins are written by me, but in some cases they have been contributed by other people. And then I've sort of, if you contribute something to Roda, it's sort of taken over by the maintainers, which is pretty much me. So even things that were developed originally by other people, I've been maintaining for quite a while. There was also a whole bunch of, like I say, plugins ship with Roda, and there are over 100 plugins that do, but there are still plugins that are external. Like I mentioned, the route introspection plugin is external. Rodoth, the authentication framework, is also a Roda plugin that's external. Some large things, like the Form A plugin that integrates Form A with Roda, is also external. It's hosted in Form A itself. So there are external plugins as well, but all the internal plugins are maintained by me and tested for every release of Roda.
And Rebuilt asked a good question. Actually, you read my mind, Rebuilt, because I was about to ask something like this. If I wanted to move from Rails to Roda, I imagine there's no way to incrementally move over.
Oh no, that you might think that, but that's actually incorrect. So the easiest way, if you're going to move from Rails to Roda, is you add Roda supports a middleware plugin, so allows Roda to operate as middleware. So you load your Roda app as middleware in your Rails, and you incrementally move over each of the routes. And then when you're done, your Rails has no routes left, and your Roda app has all the routes. And then you don't need to use Roda as middleware. Roda can be the application at that point. So that's how you can easily move from Rails to Roda. Now I say easily, and that's probably an exaggeration. One of the reasons for that is that the way Rails works and the way Roda works are quite different. So if you're heavily using stuff in Rails, like Rails, one example of this is that Rails default rendering solution, it uses sort of this customized version of ERB that's not true ERB. One of the reasons they do this is to allow you to have like in ERB, you can use like open so I think it's less than percent equals some Ruby code and then do for a block. That's not actually ERB. It's invalid ERB code. The way it works in Rails is Rails will use regexps over your entire template, figure out when you're doing that, and sort of customize ERB to work in the case where ERB was not designed to. If you have templates like that, Roda doesn't support Rails as ERB by default. I think there is a separate plugin that you can use that will do that, but it's not the default.
There's a plugin for that.
There's a plugin for that. I think I actually wrote it. I don't know if it's still maintained anymore. This was quite a few versions ago. The way Roda works, though, the way recommended ways the Roda works is it's very similar to the way eRubis and then now eRuby support escaping. So the reason Rails sort of has this thing where the other thing is that HTML escaping is sort of what I'm talking about here. With Rails, the HTML escaping is sort of, I want to say, implicit and not explicit. So when you're putting something in a template in Rails, it sort of figures out or tries to figure out, is this thing already escaped, or is it not? And if it's not, I need to escape it. This internally, it's like active support safe buffer or something, and it's supposed to figure out like, is this safe or not? And if it's not safe, then escape it. With Roda, you have to be more explicit. So idea with Roda, the recommended way to use Roda for HTML escaping is you set it on what's called escape mode, and then everything, like if you put stuff in your template, it's automatically escaped. And if you don't want it to be escaped, instead of using 1 equals in the template, you use 2. So percent equals escapes, percent equals doesn't escape. And that way you're very explicit about, I expect all this to be escaped. One of the big advantages for doing that is you can audit your templates to look at every case where things aren't being escaped. And then you can see, is that safe? So it makes it much faster to audit things for potentially unsafe usage. With Rails, every time you're putting stuff in your Rails template, you don't know whether or not Rails is going to escape it. It depends on what's passed to it. If it's passed something that's safe buffer, then it won't escape it. Otherwise, it will escape it. So I didn't like that approach that Rails uses. So that's not what Roda uses. Roda forces a more explicit escape. Cool. For certain things like that, it can be challenging to move from Rails to Roda. But even in that case, like you have an ERB template that uses sort of Rails conventions. If you're moving things over sort of on a route by route basis, you just copy the template, you would modify it. In my experience, I moved a lot, I want to say, a fairly decently sized Rails application and quite a few small ones from Rails to Roda. Again, this was back in 2014. I'm not sure how much has changed in Rails land since then, but it wasn't that difficult. I mean, most of your controller code, if you're moving controller code from Rails to Roda, a lot of cases you can just copy it and paste it into the Roda stuff. And because it's Ruby, it basically works. Now, again, there are things that need to be changed. And you do need to have fairly good tests if you're doing this. I would not recommend doing this without good tests. But if you have good tests, you can basically just copy it over, run your tests. If things break, then you fix them. Otherwise, things generally work. I could take sort of a Rails-based controller file and then copy it sort of to a Roda routing tree file and modify it, change the def, def for each action and put in like r.get or r.is, whatever it is, and almost do not really a mechanical conversion, but a fairly, without too much thought, going through and converting the Rails controller code into the Roda routing tree code. And then at the same time, for each of those routes, going through the template code, the ERB template code, and changing it. Now, if you're not using ERB, it's probably easier. If you're using Haml or Slim, those are going to work the same way in Rails that they do in Roda, pretty much. is my understanding. I'm not actually a Hamel or Slim or anything user, but my understanding
Me
it's
either.
if you're not using ERB, it's much easier to convert from Rails to Roda from a template perspective.
Because it's just a straight one-to-one
Yeah,
move it
you
over.
probably don't need to make any modifications. I'm not sure exactly how escaping works in those versions, so it's possible some of the issues it affects. I don't really have any knowledge in those areas, so I couldn't say for sure.
So I have a final question because we're running up on time here, but I have a final question for you that of personal interest to me. So I'm an old dog and I've been doing Rails for a long time. If I were to now, obviously there's a pretty significant difference in the way routing works and what I'd have to wrap my head around routing. But what kind of learning curve would I have to deal with moving from Rails to Roda after being a long-time Rails developer, other than the routing?
Okay, so the routing is the big one. So routing, controller access. The other stuff like Roda focuses just on sort of the routing code. Um, if you want to use Rails, other stuff, it's actually not that much. Like if you're using Rails and you're using Active Record, you can use Active Record with Roda.
Hmm.
Most of the other things that you use in Rails, you could just port directly. Like if you're using Active Job or Active Support, as long as you require them in your Roda app, they'll basically work the same way. So you don't necessarily have to do that. You can move fully off of all sort of the Rails dependencies. But if you just wanted to replace sort of your Rails application with Roda and keep all the active support and other stuff you're using, you can do that. Some of the other things that Rails supports by default that Roda also ships with plugins for, I mentioned like routing is sort of core Roda. Then there's sort of template handling, which Roda has a plugin for called the render plugin. Other things that Rails supports, that Roda supports directly with the plugins that ship with Roda would be handling email. So sending emails, Roda has a mailer plugin for email sending. So that'd be a sort of like Action Mailer. And then for handling incoming emails, which Rails has with Action Mailbox, Roda has a mailbox processor plugin that will do that. So other than those, Roda mostly relies on external things, like for example, Active Record. So Active Record in Rails, you can use it in Roda. There's plenty of people that do, but if you want to have a separate object relational mapper like SQL, you can easily use that. There's not tied to
Mm-hmm.
Roda. Roda doesn't enforce. Roda's not what they call a full stack framework where you have to do things a certain way. You can pick and choose the parts that you want to use and use whatever you want. I mean, it's not like we say that everything should look this way. Like another difference between Rails and Roda is that Rails comes with generators for a whole bunch of stuff because there's a Rails way to do things. You do
Mm-hmm.
Rails G and then whatever, and it generates what Rails expects you to use. Roda is flexible enough that there's not really a way to enforce it. Like people's Rails, a lot of Rails apps look very similar. Um, with my Roda apps, most of my Roda apps look very similar to my other Roda apps, but my Roda apps may look fairly different than other people's Roda apps. And some people, you can consider this, this is a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're familiar with Rails and you look at one person's Rails app, and it's much easier to train someone else's Rails app. That's the good thing is that if everything's similar, it's much easier to transition from one to the other.
Yeah.
But the advantage is if you have something customized for the way you work, it can be a big advantage. So with Roda, you basically don't have all the overhead and forced conventions. And if you like the Rails conventions, then Rails is great. If you don't like the Rails conventions, then it's often something you're fighting against, in which case you'd be better off something that didn't enforce those conventions that you don't like.
But if you like the Rails conventions, you can certainly bring them to Roda if you'd like to.
Yeah. Yeah, the only disadvantage there is that your Roda app might not look exactly like other people's Roda apps. So it depends, and I certainly understand the benefit of having apps look similar. But then there's also the thing is that what works well for some people doesn't necessarily work well for other people, and trying to shoehorn everyone into the same box often is a problem. So it's really a double-edged sword. You have to choose
Yeah.
which trade-off you want to make.
Right. Well, and there's always trade-offs in anything you do. So, wow, we are up on time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Learned a lot here. So I really appreciate you coming on, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Chat, I appreciate you guys being here too. We always love having you here and getting your questions, interacting with us. And Sire, I have to give him one of those. That's his shout out. But yeah, we will not be back next week because one of us is taking a long overdue vacation. So we won't be back next week with either Coding with Chris on Tuesday or RDDS on Thursday, but we will be back the following week with both Coding with Chris, and on May 11th we've got Ilrock coming in to talk about Hotwire. So I'm looking forward to that. That should be a fun conversation. So you can check this out on YouTube or Twitch. You can always get us here live. Also, you can find this in a podcast audio only format everywhere that podcasts live. If you want to listen to it in your car or on your, daily walk around the neighborhood. Join us at rubberduckdevshow.com. Sign up for our newsletter, which basically is, hey, we've released this week's episode. But maybe it'll turn into something else later. Who knows? Also, if you want to keep up with what's going on a daily basis, you can. I'm usually on Twitter at DuckyDevShow, and we also have a Discord server that you can join. We talk about all kinds of fun stuff on there. So we will see you in 2 weeks, and until then, happy coding!
Happy coding.